Starting the recording. So hello and welcome. If you've just joined us from Facebook, hello and welcome to this first session today, which is being a teacher with disabilities, perspectives, practices and opportunities with Nidhi Singal. Nidhi, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you so much, Joe. It's such a pleasure to be here and to just see the amazing amount of experience already and the international spread. So yeah, thank you for having me.
We're really excited to have you. And where are you joining us from today? Where are
So
you?
I'm from the sunny, very unusually sunny Cambridge in UK, in
Right.
the United Kingdom. So I'm based at the University of Cambridge.
Right, wonderful. And we've got some sunshine today, so even better. Okay, so to tell you a little bit about Nidhi Singal is Professor of Disability and Inclusive Education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. She's worked extensively with children and young people with disabilities in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Her research examines the educational experiences of children with disabilities, the quality of teaching and learning in mainstream classrooms, and the impact of schooling. So we're really interested to hear what you have to say today and to learn more about your research. Welcome, Nidhi, and over to you. I'm here if you need me.
Thank you so much, Joe. And again, a very warm welcome to everybody, different time zones, etc. So absolutely fantastic. And yes, indeed, namaste to everyone in India and who speaks Hindi in other parts of the globe. Um, so as Joe has introduced, the session is going to be focused on a research project which we recently did with teachers with disabilities working in mainstream schools in different parts of the world. It was such a privilege working in this project, given the fact that we really got to hear the stories of teachers with disabilities in different parts of the world. So I'm going to just start by asking a question, and again, would appreciate answers in the chat, please. When you are in school, so I would really want you to reflect back when you were students yourselves, were you taught by a teacher with disabilities? So could you put a yes or a no in the chat, please? Yeah. So assuming that you went to a mainstream school, were you taught by teachers with disabilities? I can already see a yes. I can see a few yeses, but I can also see a no. Yes, I don't know. Yes, no, different context. No, no, yes. Exactly. It's really varied. And whenever I usually ask this question, people tend to take a pause and think. And most of them come to a conclusion that no, they weren't taught by teachers with disabilities, especially if they had been to a mainstream school. And again, I can see some of that reflected in the answers, but it's also really positive to hear that many of you were taught by teachers with disabilities. So what I'm going to be doing today is really talking about a project, as I said, which engaged with the life experiences of teachers with disabilities. So I'm going to try and monitor my screen. If it could go ahead, that'd be really good. Okay, sorry. Now it's going ahead really quickly. Okay, so I'm going to start with Mar's story just to set the context for this discussion. And Mar was one of the teachers we interviewed in our project. And it's with Mar's permission that we have two photographs of Mar, and the visual was shared by her. Mar is a teacher with achondroplasia, that is dwarfism. She's based in Spain with 13 years of experience teaching English as a second language to teach children in the age group of pre-primary to 12 years. When we spoke to Mar, she really talked about how she values the power of education. She feels natural about having her disability and stated in her words, I wouldn't have been who I am if I was any taller. Even though she indicates that the problem is more than just her size. Mar is optimistic. She talks about how laws and authorities have changed for the better over the last 30 years. When we spoke to her, she talked about if I need something, I simply ask. When I need help, I ask. I'm not shy to ask for help. She discussed ways in which she tries to keep authority in her classroom as she felt that sometimes it might be less compared to other teachers. As an example, in a situation where Mar wanted to tell a student off, she described getting the student to sit down and have an authoritative conversation by looking each other eye to eye at the same level. However, she also talked about how it was really difficult to maintain these collegial relationships with everybody in the classroom. She explained the fact that there sometimes are very demanding situations and testing situations where children were caught laughing behind her back, or indeed parents' indication of lack of confidence and trust in her abilities. Nonetheless, she has a very positive experience of teaching younger children. And she shared this lovely photograph with us, basically drawn by one of the children in a classroom, where the child had drawn this picture of Mar and a staircase taking her up to what seems like moon. You can reach the moon if you want. Mar was one of the participants that we spoke to in this study, and these are the voices that we're going to be focusing on today. So our participants were recruited from different parts of the world. We had 25 teachers, 14 male teachers, and 15 female teachers working in mainstream schools in Brazil, Jordan, Rwanda, Spain, and Sri Lanka. These teachers themselves identified as having different types of disabilities. Some of them had physical disabilities, rather majority had physical disabilities. Some had visual impairment, hearing impairment, and attention deficit disorders in some cases. 10 of the participants had acquired disabilities at a very early stage in their life, means that they had gone through pre-teacher training, teacher training, etc. with the disability. What we did is we conducted semi-structured interviews with these teachers and participatory methods such as photo elicitation, audio elicitation with many of them. And the slide before hence talked about the visual images that Mar had shared with us. We also reviewed educational policies in these different contexts. The photograph on the right hand of the slide is just to give you an example of the kind of posters we used. We advertised this through social media, British Council, networks, etc. Some of you might have seen this call actually at some point because we did use the British Council networks quite widely in different contexts. So just to situate the whole study also in a wider context, there is definitely a very big lack of visibility of teachers with disabilities in national education policies. Many of the countries that we looked at did not have issues to do with any national policies addressing the recruitment of children with disabilities, of teachers with disabilities. They had lots of policies on children with disabilities, especially in relation to inclusive education. But surprisingly, none of them, apart from Jordan, had national policies which looked at the recruitment of teachers with disabilities, okay, and indeed the retention, etc. And within the larger research arena, academic research, which I'm very familiar with, again, the focus has primarily been on children with disabilities in the discussions on inclusive education, and also very much the literature that's available tends to be more in areas to do with the US, some in Australia, but very little from other parts of the world. And I was just wondering if anyone in the participant groups really knows of any national data sets which capture information on the disability status amongst mainstream teachers. So if you could write a yes or a no to this question, I really appreciate that, because that's been one thing one's been trying to look at. Are there any big national data sets? I can see a no already come in, and I was just wondering if anyone else knows. I can see another no. I'm sorry, I can't see the countries you're from, but Chitra, John, Rob have said no, Deepika. Oh, that's really interesting. Even in England, it's very difficult actually to find a national data set. There is data collected by one of the teacher unions Exactly, none from Italy either. Absolutely none from Vietnam, no national databases. So one of the big things we've been trying to do is say that we really need to collect this data, because having teachers with disabilities into the teaching, having teachers with disabilities in mainstream settings is really important in relation to inclusive pedagogical practices and development of inclusive cultures in school settings, but also it provides for really strong employment opportunities for children with disabilities who then go on to become adults. And with all the focus on making sure that we have more children in the classroom, I think looking at teachers who can be really truly role models is really important. Absolutely. Thank you so much. There's someone who said there are national data sets in England. Tiana Richards, thank you for that. It'll be really interesting to see what those look like. Nonetheless, the countries we were looking at, none of them had any national data sets in relation to teachers with disabilities. So what were our findings? And my next few slides are really going to be text rich. And one of the reasons for doing that is really to highlight some of the voices of the teachers that we were seeing. And I'm going to put these under different different themes that we were trying to elucidate in our research. So the very first one is around being a teacher with disabilities. This was a really important one for us. It was important because it gave us an understanding of how teachers were experiencing these mainstream settings in which they belonged. I'm going to talk about some overarching themes that emerge in the analysis of the findings. So as I said earlier, we spent substantial amount of time conducting one-to-one interviews with the teachers. Okay, so we did it online and tried to facilitate it in the most accommodating manner for each teacher's needs. And there's some really interesting trends that come up across the board for different contexts. So irrespective of the country context that these teachers were based in, all of them sometimes talked about the same things. There were some subtle differences, which I'm happy to point out, but nonetheless, they remain common. So one of the big things about being a teacher with disabilities is quite a few of them noted that it felt like working at the periphery of the mainstream school setting. So they felt peripheral both in terms of responsibilities and indeed the subject areas that they were given to teach. So just to elucidate the second point around the peripheral subject areas, for instance, we found that in Sri Lanka, many of these teachers were very much teaching subjects such as religious studies, subjects which were not language, which many a times were not having the same status, for instance, as science or mathematics, etc. In Sri Lanka, the responsibility level given to the teachers was also much lower. As Chaminda in the quote I've provided talked about, I don't have a timetable at present in my school. I've been in the school for 7 years, 7 service years, and still I don't have a timetable. This notion of a timetable was really important because that was the way of thinking about having a full status, like you had a class, you knew what you wanted to do, you were given a responsibility of a particular subject. Another participant, one of the teachers in Jordan, talked about how the head teacher in his school gave only called on his services only as an alternative teacher, just asking her to teach if anyone else in the school was absent. And this had a really significant impact on the teacher's own self-esteem. And the teacher talked about how it made them feel useless, not required to do anything. These were really significant stories in terms of how these teachers, both primarily in Sri Lanka and Jordan, felt that they were at the periphery of the mainstream education system. The second overarching theme, and actually this theme was very much dominant across the different countries, was in relation to complacency at the level of the school management. We heard time and again in the interviews how the teachers felt that they have not been well supported by the head teacher in the different context. And here we have a quote from Rwanda. Our teacher Ganza talks about, I was just considered like other people. They talked about how head teachers were not necessarily making spaces for them where they could accommodate their disabilities. They were not interested in knowing that these teachers might need any accommodation. In times when the teacher had shared the need for having accommodation, there was no accommodation made for the teachers with disabilities. And this complacency, this non-willingness to act even when they had the knowledge about a teacher's disability was rather dominant in our teacher narratives. Many of them talked about the school management not really being up to the mark in relation to supporting them. In really sharp contrast, most of the teachers really talked about largely supportive colleagues, like other peers that they were working with in these school settings. They talked about supportive colleagues, and also they talked about supportive students. And I'll elaborate on both of these aspects, but just to highlight, there was an interesting temporal dimension that emerged when we were analyzing our data. What was evident is that teachers' relationship with their colleagues really changed over time. How students perceived them also changed over time. So familiarity, rapport building, all had a significant impact on how the teachers with disabilities were perceived in their school setting. So here it's really interesting when I talk about this largely supportive colleagues. These were not necessarily colleagues just being nice to the teachers with disabilities. Rather, what our participants were saying is really highlighting is the interdependence of relationships that they were experiencing. And I think my favorite example is that of a teacher in Rwanda. So this teacher was teaching ICT, so information communication technology, so a lot to do with computers in the school, helping students understand at the basic level how computers work, etc. And this teacher talked about how he spent a considerable amount of time assisting other colleagues who are non-disabled colleagues in the school setting with things like printing, helping them put their PowerPoints together, etc. And in the same way, these other colleagues helped him fill up his payslips or sometimes other really paper and pencil tasks. So this individual, the teacher in Rwanda, had a visual impairment, and hence that was really helpful for them in order to have a colleague support them with these other written tasks. In relation to students, what again became really evident is that irrespective of the age group that the teachers were teaching, how students perceived them in a very positive way was really important. And a number of teachers talked about how the students became co-helpers in the classroom, especially when they came to know the teacher much better. So here students might help the teacher point out, help a child in the classroom might help other students see the page number where the teacher is on, because in many cases where a teacher had visual impairment, for instance, they did not have access to Braille textbooks. So they were working with textbooks which they actually could not access. And I'll talk about aids later and the challenges later. But in these cases, the students in the classroom would take on this responsibility in getting other children in the class, be aware of which page the teacher is on, which page in the textbook to look at, fetch the teacher water, simple tasks, but which help the teacher function much more easily within the classrooms. In Sri Lanka, we found this really interesting relationship of the teachers with the students, because all the teachers in Sri Lanka, the sample we had some degree of visual impairment, but they also, most of them while living in the same community and in this teaching in the same school in that community, which wasn't the case for other teachers in other parts of the world we were interviewing. So in such instances, the fact that a teacher belonged to the same village became a really interesting context for the flourishing of really positive relationships between the students, who sometimes would see the teacher walking outside in the community and would go and offer help to cross the road, etc., which the teachers really appreciated. The fourth theme that emerged very much in our study was in relation to individual resourcefulness and resilience. All the teachers, to some extent, talked about the need to be resourceful, the need to ask for help, something which also flagged in Mar's story earlier on, right? They all realized and were very aware of the fact that they had to ask for things rather than things being provided to them, okay? And they also showed a high degree of resilience in relation to really being asking for things, but also realizing that many a times they will not get those things. And this quote by Lucia in Spain really captures that very powerfully. Lucia said, "You always have to ask for everything, but you usually don't get anything." And this was really powerful because it also highlighted the huge impact on teacher well-being, the negative impact on teacher well-being in most of these contexts. But nonetheless, these teachers were powerful agents of change, or they perceived themselves to be extremely powerful agents for change. So they were agents of change in the classroom and indeed the wider society. So Pablo, one of our teachers in Spain, talked about how students are inspired by us, whether or not they can identify directly with us. So while it would seem natural that yes, children with disabilities would be hugely inspired by having teachers with disabilities in the classroom, what we also found that teachers were themselves narrating instances where they were having a positive impact on how children, all the children in the classroom, positively viewed inclusion. How they understood better issues around disability and how to engage respectfully with people with disabilities. And again, Mar's story and the lovely picture she shared with us, drawn by her student, really highlights that power of having a teacher with disabilities in the classroom. Mugisha in Rwanda talks about, "What I do, it will be a motivation for them, for the children, and indeed in the community." So as I said, earlier, many of these teachers, the ones in Sri Lanka specifically, were part of the community, but not only the fact that they were in the community, that they could, in the school community, that they could see other people could see them, but also the fact remained that when parents of children came to engage with the teachers in the school setting, through parent-teacher association or whatever the case might be in different contexts, they were usually very amazed by what these teachers were able to do. So across the board, we heard lots of different stories around either being at the periphery of responsibilities and subject areas. We saw complacency at this level of the school management, but we also had some really powerful, positive stories of how teachers with disabilities in these mainstream schools really engaged with their students, with their colleagues, and how they relied on their own individual agency and resilience. The next big theme that we explored was, what does it mean to be a teacher with disability functioning in a mainstream classroom? And really, we were here very keen to understand how and what did these teachers do in order to function effectively in these mainstream settings. And I think one of the really interesting things that came up is all these teachers really talked about being upfront about the disability. And they talked about how I'm very open with the students in the classroom about how I am disabled and hence I need some support. So that was one of the big strategies that these teachers were relying on. And we thought this was really powerful because it also meant a high degree of trust, building that trustful relationship with the children. And that requires time and effort, and also requires a certain degree of vulnerability on the part of these teachers. So that was one big strategy that they were using. But they also talked about modifying the pedagogical practices. So just to give you an example, one of our teachers in Spain talked about how this individual was assigning a lot of written work to students and gave them lots of individual feedback after the class. So this teacher I'm talking about had ADHD and would find it rather difficult to engage with so many students in a classroom. So he had 25 kids in his classroom, and he would find it very difficult to do the one-to-one. And what he used to find much more easier to do is do a lot of written feedback for the children. He would have small group discussions after class was formally over, etc. But all this required extra time, extra effort, but these teachers were doing that. In Sri Lanka, one of the teachers talked about, in relation to modifying the pedagogical practice, they talked about when I describe an activity in class, students call out the page number in the book. And absolutely, this goes back to the earlier point I was making about how the students were stepping in as co-helpers in many cases. All teachers talked about, of course, making some physical adaptations. So in Mars' instance, in the very first slide I showed you, the photograph she sent us was how she has an adaptable stool available to her in the classroom. She stands out on it, and she has this lovely big stick, which was evident in the picture, which she uses. Like this, and the stick was not to hurt the children, just to be very clear. The stick was very much to point out resources in the classroom. So anything that seemed too far away, she would use the stick to point to that, to pull it down, etc. And all teachers talked about different kinds of things. We have a few pictures which teachers shared, and I'm going to go back and show you that. So we had teachers talking about physical adaptations in relation to, ramps, requesting ramps to be built in school, talking about assistive devices. The photograph here on the top left, top right-hand corner is very much to do with air devices one of the teachers was using, etc. So they did talk about some sort of physical adaptations being available, but all of them also talked about the huge lack of accessible and adaptable teaching and learning resources. Okay, as I said earlier, a number of them spoke about how having simple things like a textbook in Braille would be so useful in helping them engage more usefully in the classroom, make it easier for them. Given this lack of physical and teaching and learning resources, adaptable and accessible teaching and learning resources, many of these teachers really relied on preparing materials in advance. So a really interesting example here is from Sri Lanka, where one of the teachers with visual impairments talked about, if I'm going to give a small written note, like for instance, the strategy being if I'm going to present something, write up a sum, or, well, none of them were teaching maths in Sri Lanka, so that's a bad example. But if we were to do a small written story or highlight a few points in written text, the teacher would prepare it earlier. And the teacher would not prepare it earlier, but get help to rather prepare it earlier. So here we had instances where the husband was helping out, or another colleague was helping out, or a child in the class was helping out. They would prepare that material in advance and take it to the class and display it to the children to say, okay, you need to copy this or engage with this, whatever the case might be. Again, what came up time and time in these reflections was, yes, they had some basic physical adaptations. In some cases, they had certain assistive devices, but the lack of teaching and learning resources which were accessible was profound. They did try their best to modify their pedagogical practices, but again, we did not see any hugely, innovative ways of engaging in relation to the teaching and learning in the classroom. What they were drawing on all the time were their own strengths and their own abilities to really work around the system rather than the system working with them. And again, I want to underline this point because what's really important to acknowledge that in all these countries, there is a very concerted and official discourse around inclusive education, about including children with disabilities into mainstream settings. What surprised us again and again is how little this discourse of inclusion extends to adults in the classroom. So the discourse of inclusion very much seemed to operate at an official discourse level, at the level of children, rather than looking at teachers with disabilities. Our next big theme in the project was really looking at experiences of training and career progression. And again, I think it is interesting to see across the board, irrespective of the country context we looked at the teacher training phase, pre-service teacher training stage, 20 out of our 25 participants reported receiving no specific support. Okay, so they had to go through the teacher training without any accommodations being made for them. And again here, this was most of them had a disability when they were going through the pre-service teacher training, and that's why you have 20 out of 25 and not 25. Some didn't. Okay, so in Sri Lanka, for instance, Asari talks about not even a single document was in Braille, so we had to get someone else to read. Again, the kind of a theme we saw in pedagogical approaches where teachers were relying on informal notions of support. So relying on the children in the classroom, relying on their partner, relying on their friends, relying on their colleagues. Similarly, that same informal support networks were the ones which supported them through pre-service teacher training. Here, many of them talked about how they became a teacher as a result of being inspired by other teachers they had engaged with. Some of them talked about how during pre-service teacher training, the training mentors, some of them would make accommodations more at an informal level rather than something that was provided or legislated in the country context. We asked all teachers, what about issues around career progression? And I'm sure it will not come as a surprise to some that 15 participants felt that primarily due to their disabilities, they will be unable to progress in their careers or take on leadership roles. Asari's response, I think, was the most telling for me. When we asked this question around, so what do you think about career progression? The prompt reply was, actually, there's no such thing. I can't even think about it. Amina and Jordan also reiterated more or less the same by saying how some people are rejected because of disability. So not due to their ability to perform as a teacher, the pedagogical skills, nothing. It's as a result of their disability. And this again mirrors the point we made earlier about the lack of support from school management, how head teachers, interestingly, were the ones who are the biggest challenges, were posing the biggest challenges in these school ecosystems for children, for teachers with disabilities. During the few months of our own interviews, etc., two of the teachers had decided to leave the profession. They were pretty fed up of having to ask for support. One had already left the profession by the time we interviewed the individual. And I think it was really telling of how the personal responsibility and the personal burden of advocacy, what impact it was having on the teachers with disabilities in these settings. Just the burden of this was huge in relation to their well-being. So then it raises the big point about what does it all add up to? What do we need to do? And not surprisingly, that was one of the big things in relation to our work with the British Council report. Like, really, what do we do? And in the report, we really highlight various different sections in terms of what the British Council should be doing, what national government should be doing, what indeed at the school level should be happening. But here I've tried to distill various recommendations that we put forward into these different points. And what was important to note here is that when we were talking to the teachers, we themselves asked, okay, what about your recommendations? So it's not just us doing this, us making the recommendation, but we really drew on the huge wealth of the lived experiences of these teachers with disabilities themselves, right? So what is it they were saying? Inclusion must be a priority across the system. And this is really interesting for us and really comes to light when I give you an example here of Rwanda. In Rwanda, teachers talked about, and a number of teachers had physical disabilities in Rwanda. So they talked about how the fact that they had to take a transport, they were unable to walk from where they live to the school setting, or unable in some cases to take the public transport because it was not physically accessible. So they had to spend money on, for instance, personal transport. So, hiring someone to take them from their home to the school and back. And that was indeed extra cost. So you can't use the bus, you can't travel on your own, you can't walk. So you're relying on this personalized service, which means there's additional costs. And that's really important to acknowledge that, for instance, in a country like Rwanda, one of the big things that teachers were talking about is low teacher salary, right? In addition to that, these are these additional costs that they had to bear because of their disabilities. How is that addressed? Is that even addressed at all? So inclusion must be a priority across different aspects of the system rather than just one little school system. So really thinking holistically about inclusion across different systems rather than in silos. There was also a really clear understanding and appreciation of the fact that if we really want teachers with disabilities to succeed in mainstream education systems, we really need to develop clear recruitment and retention policies. Okay, and this does mean including support during pre-service training of the teachers. So really ensuring that it's not just a system which is very much driven by ability in terms of its recruitment, but it also appreciates diversity and bringing in diversity at the very start. So in terms of recruitment strategies, in terms of making sure that the policies of recruitment and pre-service teacher training are inclusive. A number of teachers also talked about mandatory professional development programs to prepare school leaders. And again, it did not come as a surprise because I think one of the biggest roadblocks we were seeing in these school settings, as narrated by the teachers, were the school leaders. And I totally appreciate the point that if we had had a chance to interview the school leaders, it would have been really interesting to see the different responsibilities that they were dealing with in a system which was not, in a broader system which was not really appreciating or inclusive of diversity. So they had to make their own schools function. But nonetheless, I think there needs to be a greater dialogue and greater deal of appreciation among school leaders about how to be more inclusive, not just for children with disabilities in the school settings, but also teachers with disabilities. And what could these mandatory professional development programs look like for these school leaders? And indeed, could there be good sharing of practices across different contexts? Not surprisingly, one of the big recommendations that came up is really investing in technological infrastructure to support teachers with disabilities. Yes, it's costly, but indeed, how do you ensure that it's also cost effective? And doing so is really important, not just for the sake of a teacher with disabilities, but how useful it will be of benefit to all teachers and indeed students. And I'm not simply talking about students with disabilities, but across the board, how certain innovations which are done, maybe thinking about teachers with disabilities, can have ripple effects on everybody and everybody's inclusivity in the school setting. And here it's really important to point out when we talk about disability, we tend to assume few things. Disability as being a silo group, it's not. It intersects with issues around gender, it intersects with issues around caste, religion, location, urban or rural, etc. All these other factors have a really significant impact on how people with disabilities experience life around them. And I think that's really important to understand that we're not just talking about a siloed group, but also lots of other intersecting exclusionary variables that play out in the system. Hence, trying to accommodate one group of marginalized communities can have ripple effects on the larger school culture, is one of the ways which we advocate for better school reforms or holistic school reforms. Finally, and this is really powerful for me, is the teachers talked about the need to have opportunities which allow them to share their experiences, learn from each other, support advocacy. And indeed, this was very much evident given the fact that we were interviewing these individual teachers, many of them. I think there was just two instances where actually they knew about other teachers with disabilities in their schools nearby or something. They definitely didn't have a teacher with disabilities in their own setting, so they were completely on their own. They did not have any support structures. Most of the countries, the National Union of Teachers did not have a specific consideration for teachers with disabilities in mainstream schools. So they talked about loneliness. They talked about being the individual advocates and how having better relationships, knowing other people would really help support them. And I think a very final point was how the British Council can play a really important role in developing, for instance, these communities of practice. So I'm conscious of time and I'm going to end with the very last slide, which basically is a huge thanks to all the teacher participants. I wouldn't be saying any of this if people hadn't given up their time so generously to us, to engage with us, to share their stories, etc. And indeed to the British Council country offices who helped us in getting engaged with different teachers, etc. And indeed, Ebru Weston, who's based at the British Council, who really got us going on this project, and my colleagues and co-authors, Dr. Patricia Kwok and Dr. Thilanka Vijayasinghe, who helped with the research. So I'm going to end here and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you ever so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. That was so interesting, and it's fascinating to hear what you found, and also to hear the voices of the teachers with disabilities themselves coming through so strongly in your research. So thank you. And there's been some really interesting comments in the debate. People are contributing. It's obviously a topic that people feel is really important. So let's see if we can answer some people's questions. So I have two questions from people in Zoom, which are similar, asking about how educational institutions can better protect teachers with disabilities from discriminatory actions taken by parents. So that's a point that two people make when actually, parents are saying, oh, my child is scared, or my child, there can be a kind of bullying that goes on there. What would you recommend?
Thanks, Joe. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for that question. So absolutely, how do you get parents to realize that having a disability is not going to have a negative outcome on their children's learning in the classroom. And I think we see a rehearsal of this debate also in relation to children with disabilities. Just a few years back, I was sitting in these similar webinars and trying to explain to people that having a child with disabilities in the classroom is not going to have a bad impact or a poor impact on other children in the classroom. So I think so it's a very valid question that Kat's raised. I think it's again about having dialogue of with different stakeholders. So it's about bringing parents in, telling them why you've recruited a teacher with disabilities, allowing the teacher with disabilities to have that dialogue with the parents many a times, right? And also, as I said, there's a lovely temporal dimension to these relationships.
Yeah.
With time, we've seen changes happening, especially in relation to the parents. And it's not surprising that, of course, some of the teachers talked about that in their response, in their discussions with us. But it's really interesting. Most of them talked about how things changed once the parents came to know me. And I think that's the beautiful thing.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and it's actually it's really nice and encouraging to know that at a personal level, dialogue can be so helpful. I think a lot of us are reaching for policies and what can we do? You know, we want laws and we need policies, which is extremely important. But that's great to know, and it was interesting to hear in your talk as well that you were saying that teachers brought out the benefits, how much students learn from having a teacher with a disability, that it's actually enriching. It's not just, oh, it doesn't harm your child's education, but it's, you know, it's a learning opportunity.
Absolutely, and we in one of the other projects. So I did this in UK, in England a few years back, and I think what was really how teachers with disabilities embody inclusive pedagogy. By their very embodiment, it's inclusion, right? So how about we try and make an effort to support that?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Okay. So I'm going to go to a question from Rolly in Facebook, who's asking about some definitions around language. Can you help us with this question? What is disability and having different abilities?
Thank you so much for that. Very easy question. I think one of the most debated terminology is disability. What is disability? Believe me, the amount of academic papers that are written on what is disability itself is undertaking. So when I think about disability, and you can do it in different ways. In a different country context, disability is called different names, etc., etc. But I ascribe to the principles of the WHO, International Classification of Functioning Model. So this is WHO ICF, which very much positions disability as a biopsychosocial condition which interacts with an individual's activity and the ability to participate or not participate in activities they want to desire to participate in. Okay, so it's not just about an individual's condition, their biological condition, but it's about biopsychosocial. And the social bit is really, really important to understand. An impairment is an impairment. It becomes a disability when we try and function in a desired way in society, and when society stops us or places barriers in relation to how we want to function, that's when it's a disability. So what are different abilities, etc.? You can have lots of different ways, words of thinking. So my second language, for instance, my first language is Hindi. So in Hindi, we have a term called Viklang. Okay, so that attributes primarily to physical disabilities. But there's a new term which the government's been trying to popularize, is called Divyang. Okay, someone with very special powers. And it's really interesting to see the politics of disability language. And I think you need to some extent, for me, it's really important. All this can become really important noise at times. Who are the people that we are talking about? That's really important, and understanding their lived experiences, however they wish to define their own disability. So for instance, in this project, we were very clear. We are not asking for disability certificates. We are not asking them to define their disability. We asked them to describe their difficulties in functioning that they were having in their school setting, and we were very much asking people to self-identify if they had a disability. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Yeah, it really does. And that's so interesting what you were saying. So if I understand, then you were talking about a disability and an impairment and the biological and social, and what was the other element, sorry, of a disability?
So biopsychosocial, but
But
how does it impact on individuals'
yeah,
wish to engage in a certain activity and
yeah.
their ability or non-ability due to lots of social factors, et cetera, to participate in the activity that they desire to participate.
Right, okay. So that's when it becomes a disability, right? When you can't do something that you need to do. It's not about the impairment, it's so if we can make adjustments or allow people to participate in society in those activities, then it's no longer a disability, or it's
Absolutely. It's
yeah,
about more than no longer a disability, it's you're reducing the number of barriers to participation for an individual. And that's what we are all hopefully striving for, that everyone has a equitable playing field, isn't it? So the other things that people might be more familiar with is like the dichotomous use of medical model and social model, where the blame of the disability is placed, So the deficit is in the individual, is what a medical model very simplistically ascribes to, and the social model says, actually, it's not the individual who's deficit in something, but it's society's inability to engage with the individual. What
right.
the biopsychosocial model does is brings together the best of the both to say we need to have a more holistic understanding of the individual and the systems that people want to operate it and should operate in to be a full citizen as they wish to be.
Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, thank you. That's super interesting and really clear as well, I think. And I think as teachers, we're so interested in that, we feel like we're part of society, and that's exactly what we're concerned about, the society of our on a small scale of our classroom, our school, and wider society, right? So it's a topic very close to all of our hearts. Okay, let's see if we can do another question. Do you have any suggestions for specific strategies? So how do you, or how can we help teachers and students with learning and teaching disabilities to succeed in school? It's a very broad very broad question, but any specific classroom examples that you can think of?
So I'm not going to address the children with disabilities, because that's a whole other area. And I think we can't club the two together. It'd be very difficult. And as you said, there are no simplistic strategies. But in relation to teachers with disabilities, one of the things I'll say, ask the individual, right? I mean, how is it that you can best help them? The dialogue, the respectful dialogue is the biggest starting point. And I know it sounds so simple, but it is one of the most powerful strategies. What the teachers were telling us was there are two things operating here. People assume that they're not able to do something rather than being asked, right? So that's one thing. This teacher can't do this. No one asked me. So, hey, ask the teacher. Secondly, again, it's really important asking someone if they need any help, if they need any support, if they need any assistance can be done in a very respectful manner too. Yeah. And what these teachers were finding is that this constant self-advocacy is what they were finding most difficult, like having to ask without being given the resources or in many cases not even being given the opportunity to make their needs known.
Yes.
Right? So I think dialogue, respectful dialogue is a good starting point. And then the other thing I would say to some extent is that if you have a teacher with disabilities in your school, remember the bigger discourse is around inclusion, right? So if you think about teaching and learning materials to be more accessible, thinking about universal design for learning principles and how we operate in everyday classroom would be really important.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sorry because time is flying, and I can see people are still contributing lots of comments. So, but I think your final point about the bigger picture is inclusion is a really nice place to end, and that message about dialogue as well that's come across so strongly. So, thank you to everybody. Thanks to Naomi, who's moderating in Facebook. Thanks to Kath, who's now gone, and Melissa, who are here behind the scenes helping. And thanks once again to Nidhi. It's been absolutely fascinating and a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to take a short break in a moment. We'll share in the chat links to related content. We've got lessons on teaching English relating to that can help you with the topic of inclusion and disabilities. And there's also some courses on inclusion that we've opened this week. So all of that is going into the chat and will be sent your way. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes time for the next session. Thanks everybody and see you soon.